May 28, 1972. A light blue Ford Pinto sat stalled on Highway 33 near Goshen, Indiana. Lily Gray, 13 years old, sat in the passenger seat beside her aunt. The engine had died. Simple mechanical failure. Hazard lights blinked while they waited for help. Behind them, a Chevrolet van approached at 30 miles per hour. Not speeding, not reckless. The driver saw the Pinto too late, hit the brakes, couldn't stop. The impact wasn't severe, comparable to a parking lot collision. The Pinto's rear end crumpled inward. The fuel tank, positioned directly behind the rear axle with just 9 inches of clearance, the differential bolts, sharp, threaded steel protruding from the rear axle assembly, punctured the tank like a spear through sheet metal. Gasoline sprayed across the hot exhaust system. Ignition was instantaneous. The Pinto became an inferno within seconds. Lily Gray died in the fire. Her aunt survived with burns across 70% of her body. The van driver stood helpless. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't been drunk. He'd simply rear-ended a car at 30 miles per hour. In any other vehicle manufactured in 1972, that collision would have resulted in minor injuries or none at all. But the Ford Pinto was the product of specific engineering decisions made between 1968 and 1970, when speed trumped safety and corporate calculations valued profit margins over human life. The problem began in 1967. Volkswagen's Beetle had eaten into American market share throughout the 1960s. By 1967, VW sold nearly 500,000 Beetles in the United States annually. Japanese manufacturers were gaining ground with small, fuel-efficient imports. Ford's response was panic disguised as strategy. Lee Iacocca, then Ford's president, issued a mandate: build a car that weighed less than 2,000 pounds, cost less than $2,000, and bring it to market in 2 years instead of the normal 4-year development cycle. 2 years. Automotive development in the late 1960s typically required 48 months minimum. Crash testing revealed problems. Prototypes failed. The process was slow because human lives depended on getting it right. Ford compressed that timeline by half. Every department worked simultaneously rather than sequentially. There was no time for the iterative process that normally caught dangerous design flaws. The fuel tank placement emerged from this compressed timeline. In most vehicles, fuel tanks sat above or ahead of the rear axle, positioned to avoid intrusion during rear-end collisions. European designs placed tanks over the axle or in protected areas with substantial crush zones. Ford's engineers positioned the Pinto's fuel tank behind the rear axle, directly in the crush zone. The reasoning was straightforward. It was easiest given the vehicle's architecture, it maximized trunk space, and it required minimal manufacturing modifications. This placement meant the tank sat just 9 inches from the rear bumper. In a rear-end collision, even moderate speed impacts would compress that buffer to nothing, shoving the tank forward into the differential housing. The differential bolts became the puncture mechanism. These bolts, necessary for assembling the rear axle, protruded several inches from the housing. In a rear-end collision, they acted like fixed blades waiting to pierce whatever was shoved into them. Crush zones, the areas designed to deform and absorb impact energy, were absent behind the Pinto's rear axle. The fuel tank had no protection, no barrier, no buffer beyond those 9 inches of empty space. Ford's engineers knew about this vulnerability. Internal crash tests, conducted during the Pinto's development, revealed the fuel tank's susceptibility to rupture in rear-end collisions. Test after test showed the same result. Impacts above 25 miles per hour often caused tank rupture and fuel spillage. The fix was simple. A plastic shield or rubber bladder between the fuel tank and differential would prevent punctures. Alternative tank positioning would move the tank out of the primary crush zone entirely. Several solutions existed. all proven technology already in use by other manufacturers. The cost of implementing a protective shield was estimated at $11 per vehicle. The engineers knew the car was a rolling furnace, but the accountants held the pen. If you believe these hidden corporate histories need to be told, subscribe and join us. We are performing an autopsy on the era where profit outweighed pulse. In a windowless office in Dearborn, the calculation began. Ford's management commissioned a cost-benefit analysis to determine whether implementing the fix was economically justified. This analysis became the most damning evidence of corporate negligence in automotive history. Ford estimated that 180 people would die in Pinto fuel tank fires over the vehicle's production lifetime. Another 180 would suffer serious burn injuries. An additional 2,100 vehicles would be destroyed by fire. Then came the calculations. Ford assigned values to these projected casualties based on figures from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. A human life, $200,000. A serious injury, $67,000. A destroyed vehicle, $700. The total cost of these deaths, injuries, and property damage, $49.5 million. The cost of installing the protective shield in all Pintos, $11 per vehicle, multiplied by 12.5 million projected sales, or $137 million. The conclusion was mathematical and cold. It was cheaper to let people burn to death than to spend $11 per car to prevent it. The analysis recommended against implementing the safety modification. This wasn't a decision made by rogue engineers. This was corporate policy, approved at the highest levels, based on a calculation that explicitly valued profit over human life. Production began in 1970. Ford manufactured and sold Pintos by the hundreds of thousands. The cars were popular, affordable, economical, exactly what the market wanted. The fires started almost immediately. Rear-end collisions that should have been survivable turned into infernos. Victims burned to death in crashes where the impact itself hadn't caused fatal injuries. The pattern was consistent: moderate-speed rear-end collision, fuel tank rupture, instant fire, death. Ford received reports. Internal documents showed the company was aware of the problem within the first year of production. But the cost-benefit analysis held. Management had decided that 180 deaths were an acceptable cost of doing business. The fires continued through 1972, 1973, 1974. Each one followed the same mechanical sequence. Some victims died instantly. Others burned alive, trapped in vehicles with doors that had jammed shut from the collision. The legal reckoning began in 1977 when Richard Grimshaw sued Ford Motor Company. Grimshaw had been a passenger in a Pinto that was rear-ended and caught fire. He survived but suffered severe burns. During discovery, Grimshaw's attorneys obtained the internal Ford documents, including the cost-benefit analysis. When that memo was presented in court, the calculation that valued human life at $200,000 and concluded it was cheaper to let people die, the case transformed. The jury heard testimony about the crash tests Ford had conducted. They learned that Ford's own engineers had demonstrated the fuel tank's vulnerability and proposed solutions. They saw the $11 figure, the trivial cost that would have prevented the fires. The verdict, delivered in February 1978, was unprecedented. The jury awarded Grimshaw $2.5 million in compensatory damages. Then they added $125 million in punitive damages, an amount specifically chosen to punish Ford for its calculated indifference to human life. The judge reduced the punitive damages to $3.5 million, but the message was clear. A jury of ordinary Americans had looked at Ford's cost-benefit analysis and recoiled in horror. The Grimshaw verdict opened floodgates. Dozens of other Pinto fire victims filed suits. Each case revealed more internal documents, more evidence of Ford's knowledge, more proof that the company had chosen profit over safety. In 1978, Indiana prosecutors took an unprecedented step. They brought criminal charges against Ford Motor Company for reckless homicide in the deaths of 3 teenage girls killed when their Pinto was rear-ended and burst into flames. It was the first time an American corporation faced criminal prosecution for a defective product. Ford was acquitted in that criminal case, but the damage was done. The company's reputation was destroyed. Ford recalled the Pinto in 1978, finally implementing the protective modifications that would have cost $11 in 1970. By then, estimates suggested between 27 and 180 people had died in Pinto fuel tank fires. The scandal changed automotive regulation fundamentally. It led to stricter fuel system integrity standards, mandatory crash testing at higher speeds, and federal oversight that forced manufacturers to prioritize safety over cost-cutting. But the deeper impact was cultural. The Pinto revealed that American manufacturers, faced with foreign competition and pressure to cut costs, would sacrifice safety to maintain profit margins. That trust, once broken, never fully returned. Japanese manufacturers capitalized on the scandal. Toyota and Honda advertised their commitment to quality and safety. They positioned themselves as the responsible alternative to Detroit's corner cutting. Market share that had been gradually shifting to imports accelerated dramatically after 1978. The $11 decision became shorthand for corporate malfeasance. Business schools taught the Pinto case as an example of catastrophic ethical failure. Engineering programs used it as an illustration why safety cannot be compromised for cost savings. The engineers who designed the Pinto's fuel system weren't villains. They were professionals working under impossible constraints, told to design a car in half the normal time while hitting aggressive cost targets. When they identified the fuel tank vulnerability and proposed solutions, management rejected those solutions based on cost-benefit analysis that valued profit over safety. The Pinto became a cultural reference point for corporate negligence. Lily Gray died in 1972. The protective shield that would have saved her life cost $11. That was the trade-off, calculated and documented in internal memos that would later be read aloud in courtrooms across America. But the government's response to the Pinto fires triggered something nobody anticipated. In 1973, while Pinto still burned on American highways, federal regulators passed the 5-mile-per-hour bumper standard. The rule seemed simple. Bumpers must protect vehicles in collisions up to 5 miles per hour without damage. What emerged were battering rams, massive chrome structures that added hundreds of pounds to every car. Bumpers that projected so far forward they changed the entire aesthetic of American automotive design. And the reason they existed traced directly back to the burning Pintos that proved manufacturers couldn't be trusted to build safe cars without federal mandates forcing them to. The era of massive, ugly, overbuilt bumpers, the chrome monstrosities that defined 1970s cars, began as a direct regulatory response to the Ford $11 calculation. When companies proved they'd let customers die to save money, the government responded by mandating solutions so extreme they reshaped automotive design for a generation. Here's the question worth asking. When corporations demonstrate they'll calculate acceptable death tolls to maximize profit, how heavy-handed should regulation become? The Pinto fires led to bumper standards that added weight, killed fuel economy, and made cars uglier for decades. Was that overreach, or the only way to force safety when manufacturers wouldn't voluntarily provide it? Share your perspective in the comments.